In the aftermath of World War I, Germany stood at a crossroads. The nation had been humiliated by defeat, burdened by reparations, and torn apart by political extremism. Democracy, in the form of the Weimar Republic, struggled to take hold, fragile and contested from the outset. Within this precarious environment, laws that were meant to protect freedom became tools of fear. Justice, once a safeguard, would be turned into a weapon. This is the story of how the Nazi regime transformed the German legal system into an instrument of terror, how ordinary citizens became subject to an ever-tightening grip of control, and how the manipulation of the law can silence voices, crush dissent, and reshape reality itself. After the First World War, Germany's legal system faced enormous challenges. The Weimar Republic inherited institution from the Kaiser's Reich, designed for an authoritarian monarchy rather than a democracy. Courts were under-resourced, judges were often conservative, and there was a stark inconsistency in how laws were applied. The Weimar justice system had a troubling tendency. Right-wing extremists, like Freudian corps members, monarchists, and paramilitary groups often face lenient treatment for violent acts, while left-wing activists, particularly communists and socialists, were prosecuted aggressively. This imbalance created a perception of bias and undermined faith in the judicial impartiality. The Nazi Party, emerging in the 1920s as a radical nationalist movement, recognized an opportunity. They exploited the weakness of the Weimar Law, portraying themselves as defenders of order against the inherent enemy, often framing communists and Jews as threats to the nation. The court's inconsistencies and the slow pace of justice, and the ideology divide within the legal profession, would provide a stepping stone for the Nazis' later total control. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within weeks, the Nazis began a systematic transformation of the legal system to align with their ideology. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, provided the pretext for emergency measures. The Reichstag fire decreed suspended civil liberties, allowing the arrest of political opponents without due process. Communists, socialists, and dissenters were detained, often indefinitely, under the guise of protecting the nation. The Enabling Act of March 23, 1933, legally granted Hitler the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval. This act effectively dismantled the Weimar Constitution and created the legal foundation for dictatorship. Judges and prosecutors who resisted the new regime were removed or intimidated. One of the first targets was the legal profession itself. Jewish judges and lawyers were expelled from the courts. Political opponents and those suspected of sympathizing with democracy were barred from practicing law. The judiciary, once a safeguard against tyranny, became a mechanism of exclusion, enforcing racial purity and political conformity rather than justice. By 1934, the Nazi regime had begun reshaping the very definition of law. Legal code was rewritten to criminalize speech, thought, and associations deemed anti-German or unpatriotic. Laws, such as the law of restoration of the professional civil service, ensured that only the loyal to the party could hold positions in the legal system. This law laid the groundwork for a judiciary entirely subservient to the regime. The establishment of the Volksgerichtshof, or People's Court, in 1934 exemplified the weaponization of the justice. This court, ostensibly designed to handle cases of treason and political crimes, became a theater of terror. Judges like Roland Friesland conducted proceedings with theatrical cruelty, often humiliating defendants and ensuring predetermined guilty verdicts. Sentences were severe. Death, imprisonment, and public shaming were common. The People's Court turned into propaganda, reinforcing the regime's dominance while eradicating opposition. Laws against treason was broadened. Ordinary acts of dissent, a critical remark, an association with a suspected group, or even refusing to join the Nazi organization could be prosecuted as a political crime. The legal system no longer adjudicated based on evidence or fairness. It enforced loyalty. With the legal framework in place, the Nazis deployed law as an instrument of terror across every level of society. The Gestapo, operating under the guise of legality, could arrest citizens with minimal evidence. Concentration camps were effectively legalized detention centers, where people accused of political or racial crimes were imprisoned without trial. The Nuremberg Law of 1935 codified racial discrimination. Jews were stripped of citizenship, forbidden from marrying or having relations with Germans, and barred from professional life. These laws were enforced by courts that had been purged of independent judges. Every judicial decision reinforced Nazi ideology, making legal compliance inseparable from participation in the regime. Clergy, intellectuals, and educators became targets. Teachers who failed to teach Nazi ideology faced dismissal. Religious leaders who opposed racial laws or the cult of personality around Hitler were silenced, often through legal prosecution framed as upholding public order. Ordinary Germans lived in constant fear of the law. Neighbors could denounce one another, and the courts validated those denunciations. The consequences were catastrophic. Families were torn apart, communities destabilized, and lives destroyed. People were imprisoned or executed for a minor infraction, often after show trials designed to serve as a public warning. The judicial system no longer protected citizens, it punished them for perceived disloyalty. Writers, artists, and intellectuals were censored or exiled. Universities expelled professors who did not conform to Nazi ideology. Even small acts, such as listening to foreign radio broadcasts or criticizing party policies in private, could lead to prosecution. Fear became self-persuasive. Self-censorship replaced free thought. Justice was no longer an abstract idea. It was the machinery of repression. The Nazis understood that law could serve both as punishment and as spectacle. Trials were broadcast and reported in newspapers, portraying defendants as enemies of the state. Public executions of political opponents, often following court convictions, reinforced the illusion of legality while terrifying the populace. The People's Court, in particular, demonstrated how performance could replace fairness. Defendants were berated, shadowed at, and publicly humiliated. Verdicts were predetermined. Judges acted as prosecutors and executioners simultaneously. The court was a stage. Law was the script. And the outcome was always dictated by ideology. Through this system, the Nazis taught Germans to associate legality with obedience and dissent with danger. The law became a weapon not just to punish, but to shape belief, opinion, and behavior across society. With the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, the judicial system that had enforced tyranny collapsed. Allied forces, recognizing the corruption and complicity of German judges, conducted trials at Nuremberg to hold leaders accountable. The world learned that the appearance of legality could mask profound injustice, and that judges and courts could be complicit in atrocities if the rule of law is subverted. Post-war Germany instituted reforms to prevent such abuses from recurring. The Federal Republic codified judicial independence and emphasized human right protections to ensure that the law can never again be weaponized to enforce ideology rather than justice. History offers lessons, and the weaponization of justice in Nazi Germany resonates beyond its own time. In 2025, political commentators and legal scholars have raised concerns about the actions of the United States that echo the aspects of historical authoritarianism. Not identical in scale or context, but concerning in principle. Rhetoric questioning judicial independence, attempts to politicize courts, and pressure on the legal institutions to serve loyalty rather than impartial justice have been a prominent topic of debate. Some argue that using law as a tool to protect allies and punish opponents undermines trust in democratic institutions, erodes norms, and creates a climate where law becomes a political weapon. While the US is a fracturing democracy under this regime, with robust checks and balances, the Nazi example demonstrates the danger of allowing political power to influence courts, prosecutors, and legal enforcement. Independent courts, free speech protections, and legal impartiality are not abstract ideas. They are safeguards against tyranny. Historical parallels serve as a warning. When leaders attempt to weaponize justice, even in democracy, the erosion of rights and the chilling of dissents can follow. And we see this right now with Trump and his regime. Them going after James Comey just because he fought against the regime after being released by the regime is another way of going after political opponents. We see that the safeguards are slowly being removed. This led to tyranny in Germany. The Nazis demonstrated how the danger of allowing political influence into the court can be destructive to the judicial system in a whole. And we see this now with hiring loyalists over people who are actually qualified to do the job. The story of Nazi Germany's legal system is a stark reminder of the power of the law and the fragility of justice. What began as courts, codes, and regulations became tools of terror, silencing dissent, enforcing ideology, and legalizing genocide. Ordinary citizens, professionals, and intellectuals were caught in the machinery that disguised brutality as legality. The legacy is clear. Justice is not merely a system of rules. It is the foundation of freedom. When law becomes a weapon, society itself becomes the target. Vigilance, transparency, and independence are essential. History warns that the erosion of judicial integrity, the politicalization of the courts, and the manipulation of legal institutions are not distant threats. They are the first steps towards tyranny. The Nazi era reminds us that the rule of law is precarious, and when it is abandoned, humanity pays a terrible price. Its lessons endure, compelling generations to guard the independence of justice, to protect the vulnerable, and to remember that freedom is only as strong as the courts that defend it. This has been a production of the Political Besties Network. Thank you for listening to The Continuum.